Good evening and welcome to another quiet night of forgotten human history, where everything drifts slowly like candle wax and the world falls, asleep to the strange and the soft, the true and the nearly unbelievable. Let us begin tonight with a year that seemed to slip into darkness. Not metaphorical darkness, not the kind wrapped in political metaphor or poetic gloom, but a real darkness that fell across the skies and left behind silence and cold and a strange knowing that something had gone wrong in the heavens above. It began in the year 536, a year that Procopius, a Byzantine historian, would later call the beginning of a time when the sun gave forth its light without brightness like the moon during an eclipse, and the day was shadowed and gray even at noon. From Ireland to Mesopotamia, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the shifting sands of the Arabian Peninsula, something unseen above had pulled a curtain across the sky, and what followed was not just colder weather or fewer harvests, but something much deeper and more spectral, a feeling that the very balance of the world had cracked. Cassiodorus, writing from the court of the Ostrogoths, described a sun that was bluish, not gold, dim and weak, and casting neither shadow nor warmth. The stars were visible in the middle of the day, and in the cities, people lifted their faces toward the sky, wondering if they were being punished or warned, or perhaps merely forgotten by the forces that had once kept nature in rhythm in China. The chronicles recorded frost in summer and failing crops in Ireland. The annals of Ulster noted a failure of bread in the year of the Great Darkness. This was not an age of instant communication or scientific clarity, and so the mystery festered across cultures. It seeped into temples and churches, into marketplaces and monasteries. The sky had gone wrong, and no one knew why. No one understood what had caused it. But everyone felt its chill. Farmers stared at their withered fields, where young barley should have risen, and instead found blackened stumps that crumbled beneath the fingers. In what is now Syria, priests told stories of judgment and fire. But there was no fire, only the weight of the gray, lightless days and the bitter nights when sheep curled together and humans wondered if the sun would ever return. The darkness did not fall all at once, but drifted slowly, like a thick velvet cloth unspooling across the heavens. First, there were the odd sunsets that seemed to fade too fast. Then the days grew shorter and colder than memory allowed by the height of summer. The sun itself looked sickly, pale and ashen, and the warmth never came. The birds were confused. They migrated in the wrong directions, or not at all. Crops failed, bees vanished in some regions. Famine began with a whisper, and then arrived fully as granaries emptied and livestock died, and the hungry began to search for meaning among the ruins of their ordinary lives. In Constantinople, Procopius, who served the general Belisarius, wrote of the unnatural gloom with a scholar's detachment, but beneath his words lay a deep disquiet. How could empires thrive when the sky itself had changed? How could men fight wars, or build temples, or pray properly when the sun had abandoned them? He was not the only one to ask these questions. They echoed through the corridors of power and the back streets of villages, where the only answer was the hollow growl of an empty stomach. In Arabia, poets turned their verses toward omens and blood-red moons in Rome. The last flickers of imperial confidence gave way to candles lit at all hours of the day, just to see one another's faces in China. Historians recorded that snow fell in summer and locusts devoured what few crops survived in Korea. Monks noted the cold with sorrow and wondered whether it signaled the end of a cycle or the end of the world. People turned inward to their stories, to old prophecies, and to whispered prayers. The Zoroastrians saw it as a battle between light and darkness, where evil had momentarily triumphed. Christians saw signs of the Book of Revelation, and some began to confess their sins, not out of guilt, but in quiet panic. Buddhists meditated on impermanence, but even their temples grew cold. What is so haunting about the year 536 is not only what was seen, but what was not seen. No dragons in the sky, no flaming wheels, no battles of gods and angels, only the strange blank sky and the questions it brought. What happens when the natural world becomes unknowable again? What happens when the thing you trusted to rise every morning does not burn, does not warm, but merely hovers above you like a dying ember in the hearth? The darkness lasted not a day, not a week, but for many months, and by some accounts even longer than a year. Crops failed to seasons in a row, and famine gripped entire continents. In the Byzantine Empire, trade slowed to a crawl, soldiers grew restless, and borders weakened. In the forests of Germania and Gaul, tribes began to move again, driven not by conquest, but by hunger. In the British Isles, small kingdoms broke apart and vanished into legend. In India, the Gupta Empire weakened beneath the weight of drought and unrest. And still the sun did not shine, even in Africa and the Americas. Though distant from the written chronicles of Europe, there is evidence of suffering lakes. Dried temples were abandoned. Cities grew quiet. In Peru, the great city of Tiwanaku showed signs of sudden stress. In Mexico, the Maya began one of their first major periods of decline. And in the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones began to change their settlement patterns. The world was not ending, but it was changing, and fast. Later scientists would find clues frozen in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. Thin layers of volcanic ash and sulfates, preserved like the fingerprints of an ancient crime. They would discover that tree rings across the world showed stunted growth. Beginning precisely in 536, they would match the whispers of Procopius and Cassiodorus with data pulled from the earth itself, and they would begin to suspect that what people had witnessed was not merely a fluke of weather, but the aftermath of a massive volcanic eruption. But in the moment, there was only mystery and cold and fear. The great empires trembled not because of invasion, but because the sun had lost its power. And when you live in a world where nature is both clock and God, that kind of disruption is more than a crisis. It is a rewriting of reality itself. In the towns and villages, mothers told children stories of why the sun had gone away. Some said it had been swallowed by a dragon, others that it had turned its back on mankind out of sorrow or anger or divine boredom. In monasteries, monks copied psalms and added marginal notes about the strange light and the strange cold. Some quietly wondered whether the second coming had already begun and they had been left behind. This was not the apocalypse, but it taught people how to imagine one. It showed how fragile the rhythms of human life truly are, how quickly the assumptions of agriculture, of trade, of power can fall apart when the sky no longer behaves. And so we drift now into the stillness that followed that strange, dark year, a stillness that would eventually give way to hunger and plague and empire in retreat. But for now we stand in the twilight of history, where the days grow short and the nights long, and a soft, uncertain light filters through the branches of the past. In the next part of our journey, we will step quietly into the realm of science, into the frozen signatures of fire that may explain what turned the skies dim and the summers cold. But for now, rest gently in the knowledge that even in great darkness, people kept writing, kept praying, kept feeding one another, kept watching the sky for a sign of return. This was only the beginning. In the slow, dim hours after the year that was not a year, the skies remained strangely wrong. The sun, when it showed itself, looked like a brass plate dulled by centuries of touch. Its light had lost its edge. It cast no real warmth. The day resembled twilight, and the twilight resembled dusk, and the dusk bled softly into night, like ink in a basin of cold water. For centuries, people believed this darkening came from heaven itself, a divine warning, a sky turned inward with grief. But in modern times, slow and silent revelations would emerge from places deep beneath the feet and high into the ice that never thaws. These discoveries would whisper of fire, not spirit, a violent light, not celestial shadow, a volcano, perhaps colossal beyond imagining, erupting somewhere in the northern curve of the world. It may have happened in Iceland or somewhere near the lands that would one day be called North America. The eruption left no written witness. Its ash did not speak, but what it did was blot out the light, first in the upper skies, and then, for months and months, across the faces of the people who lived and wondered and did not understand. They called it punishment. They called it eclipse. They did not yet call it geology. It would not be until the age of ice cores that science began to pry open the frozen tomb of that moment. Deep within the glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica, each year leaves a layer of snow pressed into ice, a record of air and dust and sky. By drilling into these ancient layers, researchers unearthed a strange signal spikes in sulfuric acid and volcanic sulfate deposits around the year 536. The chemistry revealed the fingerprint of something violent. A volcano so vast it filled the stratosphere with fine particles of sulfur and ash. These aerosols, lighter than dust and slower than breath, rose into the sky and formed a gauzy veil across the earth. They scattered sunlight, turning it cold and flat. For 18 months the sun was a stranger, filtered through this gauze, robbed of its strength, unable to warm the soil or awaken the seeds. Ice core records from Greenland showed 2 such sulfur-rich bands, one around 536 and another several years later, likely from a second eruption. This suggested not one terrible event, but 2, as if the earth itself had a slow fit of rage and sorrow. Tree rings echoed this story, though in wood and not in ice. Across northern Europe and parts of Asia, trees grew narrow bands during these years. It meant they were starving for light. The narrowness of a tree ring is a kind of historical sigh, a living thing trying to survive through days without the sun. In Ireland, oak trees stopped growing altogether for several years. In China, records spoke of yellow dust and summer frosts. Crops failed. People wandered. In Peru, even across the hemisphere, the same lean rings and unusual climate echoes were found. The effect was global. The reach of the volcano, global. But the volcano itself remained hidden, a ghost with fiery lungs that had long since turned to stone. Some scholars pointed to Iceland's volcanoes, particularly Katla, or whose black basalt veins trace ancient scars across the landscape. Others imagined it came from the Americas, perhaps the Ilopango volcano in El Salvador, or from a submerged caldera somewhere still unnamed. There is no agreement. The mountain that changed the sky has no memorial, but its breath covered the earth and its silence stretched for years. Recent studies using tephra, glassy shards of volcanic ash, began to narrow the field. Certain particles matched specific regions, and some suggested the eruption in 536 was followed in 540 by another in the tropics. If true, the world would have barely begun to recover when the darkness returned. 2 winters stitched into one. Volcanic winter is a term only modern science can use. The ancients had no such phrase, but they felt its bite. The sulfate aerosols that entered the stratosphere blocked sunlight and cooled the Earth's surface. Global temperatures may have dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius. That might seem small to the waking mind, but to a world without electricity or storage or synthetic clothing, it was a death sentence written in snow. Crops failed across continents. The Nile River froze in some places. Summer frosts ruined barley fields. Famines spread like whispers in a cathedral, and famine is never silent. It births fever and grief and displacement. It unhinges old orders. It accelerates collapse. In Constantinople, Procopius wrote that the sun gave no light for over a year, and that crops withered under cold skies. He did not know why. In Ireland, the Annals of Ulster recorded a failure of bread in the year 536. In China, snow fell in summer, and the harvests failed. In Mesoamerica, the Maya left glyphs of disruption and unrest. In the Andes, human sacrifices increased. Every culture translated the sky's silence into its own language of fear. They buried offerings, they fasted, they accused, and they remembered. The 6th century was already a fragile time. The Roman Empire had fallen in the West. The Eastern Roman world clung to old systems under Justinian, who would soon face the plague. The darkness did not cause all collapse, but it arrived like a thief to a house already weakened. When light dims, people look for meaning. In the wake of the volcanic winter, entire societies were pushed towards spiritual reckoning. Some may have turned to older gods, others hardened into stricter Christian devotion. Either way, the veil in the sky mirrored a veil over certainty itself. When the sun abandons you, something must be to blame. It is tempting to imagine them looking up, as we do, scanning the heavens for signs. But they had no satellites, no weather models, no volcanic advisory bulletins. The cause of the strange cold was invisible. It came with no warning and left no voice. Even now, the volcano or volcanoes that caused it remain unnamed. Iceland is still a strong candidate. Eruption in the late 930s is the largest known basaltic flood in human history. If a comparable event happened in 536, it would have been enough. But Ilopango's explosion in Central America has also left deep volcanic footprints. The conversation continues, slow and glacial, like the core that first told the tale. What we know is this: sulfur from the stratosphere falls eventually, and it falls into ice, and that ice can be read like a scripture of the Earth's pain. Modern science has turned those glacial pages and found in them the traces of ash, the chemistry of suffering. And this suffering left marks not just in trees and ice, but in people. The famine weakened immune systems. The darkness blurred time. In this environment, the bubonic plague found a vulnerable host. In 541, 1 year after the supposed second eruption, the plague of Justinian began. It spread through ports and arteries of trade, carried by fleas and rats and breath. It may have killed 30 to 50 million people over the next 2 centuries. It may have been shaped, in part, by the weather, by the cooling, by the changes in rodent behavior, all of which began when the volcano breathed its invisible breath into the upper sky. Today, we see the outline of this catastrophe in data. But the people of 536 saw it in frost and failed wheat and the hollowness of their children's cheeks. It was the kind of disaster that is not loud but long. It stretched across lives. It entered songs and folklore and omens. It softened the skin of the sun and made people wonder if time itself had shifted. Perhaps it had. A year without sun is a year without memory, a kind of waking dream. It is not surprising that medieval chroniclers remembered it not as a season, but as an era. The darkness came, the crops failed, the light returned, eventually, but trust in the sky had been shaken. There are things science cannot measure. The exact number of the dead is unknowable. The names of the fields that failed are forgotten. The poems, written during that gray time, are mostly lost or unwritten, but something remains in the hush of ice and the narrowness of tree rings. Something remains in the historical fragments that survived, and in our understanding of volcanic winter, we are slowly reconstructing a mystery that once lived only in dread. The sun was no longer golden. It was a pale and distant thing, hidden behind a sky that refused to shine. Across the trembling fields of Europe, the crops withered in their beds, their stalks limp and unconvincing, their roots soaked or stunted. In the east, across the steppes of Central Asia and the river valleys of China and India, the skies had turned to cold, or too wet, or too confused for farming. The land began to sigh, and then to crack, and then to starve. It was the beginning of the Great Famine, a slow and brutal undoing of everything that once seemed dependable. The earth itself seemed to shiver, and with it all of humanity. The year 1315 is often remembered in pale ink as the start of the famine, but the truth was thicker than a date. It was not one moment, but a smothering fog of failures that stretched like a dying vine through most of Europe and parts of Asia and the Middle East. The weather had changed so slowly at first that no one paid attention. A little more rain than usual, a little less sunlight. Then came the floods, then came the rot. Wheat would not grow, oats dissolved in mud. Even barley, which usually resisted everything, turned sour in the field. The climate had collapsed, not with thunder, but with a hush and the silence of empty barns. Trade routes that once brought grain from warmer regions began to fail. Flooded roads, bandits, borders that bristled against refugees and strangers. Local economies that once thrived on surplus were now negotiating hunger. Fish spoiled, pigs ate their own litters. The markets emptied. In villages where hunger arrived first, people looked to the priests, and then to the sky, and then to each other. Children began to disappear into death, not quickly but in pieces. First the hunger slowed them, then it bent them, then it closed their eyes. Parents tried to pray, but their stomachs would not let them concentrate. Some believed it was divine punishment and pointed to recent wars, or corrupt bishops, or the sin of vanity. Others believed it was witchcraft, or a curse, or a foul alignment of the stars. There were no explanations that could bring back the apples that rotted too early, or the sheep that collapsed with glassy eyes. In monasteries, monks recorded the losses in tired script, sometimes adding a cross beside the names. In towns, the bells tolled far too often. In cities, the poor died in heaps, their bodies stacked like firewood along walls that could not keep death out. Climate records hidden in tree rings and ice cores now tell us the truth, or at least a colder version of it. A period of global cooling, now known as the Little Ice Age, had begun to whisper its way through the seasons. Volcanic eruptions may have sent sulfur into the sky, blotting out sunlight. Ocean currents shifted. Winds became cruel. Crops that had fed millions could no longer grow where they once had. it was not just Europe. In parts of Asia, similar patterns emerged. In Yunnan, China, harvest failures were noted in court records. The Delhi Sultanate saw rice shortages. Across Eurasia, the world had become too tired to feed its people, and so hunger became a shared language. In England, it was spoken through the aching ribs of peasants who sold their tools for a handful of beans. In France, through the weeping of mothers who could no longer nurse. In Germany, through the hollow faces of beggars lining church steps. And in villages where hunger pushed the hardest, strange things began to happen. People ate grass or bark. They boiled shoe leather. In the worst places, the stories grew darker. Rumors of cannibalism appeared not in wild tales, but in quiet confessions. The Annals of Duisburg from the year 1316 mention mothers who fed on the flesh of their own dead children. In Flanders, bodies disappeared from cemeteries. In Poland, some townsfolk were caught boiling corpses stolen from plague pits. These were not acts of evil, but of despair. The rules of the living bent under the weight of death. Hunger is not merely absence, it is a force. It rewrites love, it dismantles shame, it becomes a god of gnawing and emptiness. As famine spread, the social order began to rot along with the wheat. Nobles who once feasted now hoarded. They raised taxes on peasants already eating moss. Kings issued proclamations about fair prices for bread, but their words did not bring back the sun. The poor, rioted grain warehouses were burned. Priests led processions of starving parishioners, begging heaven for mercy. But heaven was distant. The churches echoed. God seemed to be looking the other way. In Italy, Boccaccio would later write of plague, but hunger came first. Hunger softened the land for death to walk through. In the papal city of Avignon, even the cardinals complained of thin stews and disappearing servants. In Iceland, the famine was so severe that whole settlements vanished. In Norway, farmers abandoned their land. In England, between 1315 and 1317, chroniclers estimate that 10 to 15% of the population died not from war or plague, but from hunger alone. The famine was not even, it was cruelly precise. In some areas, a single season failed, and the people starved. In others, they managed to scrape through. Entire communities were erased from history simply because the river flooded one too many times. Some areas saw parents selling children into servitude. Others saw children selling themselves. The markets did not collapse with a bang. They simply stopped breathing. Coins meant nothing without bread. The medical texts of the time offer little comfort. Hunger was not well understood as a biological condition. It was seen as a spiritual affliction, a sign of imbalance in the body, or a punishment from God. Physicians offered purges or bleeding. In some cases, they prescribed stale bread soaked in vinegar to ease the bloating that comes before death. Others recommended charms or amulets or prayers to Saint Nicholas. None of it mattered. The famine was stronger than faith, and yet life went on. Somehow, in monasteries, monks continued to chant, even as their numbers dwindled. In cities, the remaining bakers rationed crumbs to those who could barter. Mothers still sang lullabies, though their arms were empty. The world was not ending, it was adjusting to a colder climate, to fewer mouths, to different expectations of what survival looked like. Eventually, the rains lessened. The sun began to reappear, not brightly, but enough. Crops returned slowly, barley, then oats, then wheat. But the memory of the famine stayed behind. It crept into language, into law, into marriage, customs, and religious fears. People who had watched their neighbors eat bones did not forget. In some villages, memorials were built not for kings or saints, but for the dead of famine. No names, just the idea of them. Historians now trace much of the instability of the later Middle Ages to the ripple of this famine. The weakened bodies, the desperate choices, the lost trust in institutions. By the time the Black Death arrived in 1347, it met a population already softened by hunger, already broken in parts, already familiar with death. The famine was not an isolated tragedy. It was a prelude, a whisper before the scream. In some strange corners of medieval medicine, hunger itself became a kind of diagnosis, a condition that could cause madness, melancholia, desperation. One physician wrote that prolonged starvation caused the humors to boil upward, corrupting the soul. Another suggested that hunger made men more likely to sin, more likely to dream of forbidden things, to imagine bodies in ways they should not. Hunger and desire tangled in strange ways in the medieval mind. Famine made people rethink the sacredness of the body. When you have seen it eaten or wasted or sold, you do not pretend it is holy in the same way. Death became familiar. The corpse no longer shocked. It became part of the background. And from this came a strange kind of calm, a detachment, a knowledge that life is not promised, that bread is never guaranteed, that the sky can close itself like a book. This was not a world of endless suffering, but it was a world where suffering was expected, where resilience was not praised because it was universal. Everyone had to bend. Everyone had to learn how to starve with dignity or shame. And through it all, the human story continued, slower, sadder, stranger, but still moving. The wind shifted again, and it was no longer dry but heavy, with a strange sweetness, the kind that clung to cloth and skin and the edges of prayer. The people who had endured the skies dimming and the crops collapsing now began to notice a new and quieter dread, one that arrived not in famines or frost, but in the trembling of the body, in the swelling of the glands, and in the stillness that followed all through the Eastern Roman Empire. The strange quiet spread from street corners and monastery cloisters to bathhouses and granaries and city walls. The air carried it, and no one could say where it had begun or why it had chosen this particular moment to arrive, and yet, in hindsight, it seemed inevitable, as if hunger and fear had opened a gate, and what slipped through was death dressed in silence. It was the year 541 when the first whispers began in the Egyptian port of Pelusium. Ships loaded with grain and silks and letters brought more than cargo. They carried something unseen, something that did not clink or crumple or rustle in the hold, but instead lived in the shadows between human proximity, carried in the fleas, clinging to the backs of rats, and the rats that nestled in the food stores of the empire. No one could see the chain of transmission, not the imperial postmasters, not the priests, not the physicians. They simply saw that people began to die, and that the dying would not stop. From Egypt, it moved to Alexandria, and from there across the Mediterranean into the heart of the Byzantine world. The great city of Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, the city guarded by walls and saints and relics, found that none of these could protect against the thing that crept in along its docks. The plague, now called the Plague of Justinian, arrived like a second sun, except it gave no warmth, only decay. Emperor Justinian himself would fall ill, but survive, unlike tens of thousands who perished around him. The numbers are difficult to comprehend in some parts of the empire. It is said that entire villages vanished in days, that bodies lay unburied in streets, that the living were too few or too frightened to tend to the dead. Procopius, the imperial historian, recorded scenes where homes were left with doors open, flies gathering where the only sounds were the barking of stray dogs and the cries of those trying to lift corpses into carts with cloths over their faces. People fled the cities, but the plague followed, not bound to walls or waters, but to bodies moving through the empire. At its height, the plague may have killed 100,000 in Constantinople alone, possibly more. The death toll across the empire is estimated by some modern scholars to have reached 50 million over the course of repeated outbreaks over the following 2 centuries, which may have been over half the population of the entire Mediterranean world at the time. Yet numbers cannot capture the slowness with which fear bloomed in the body, nor the strange, surreal rhythm that took hold of society as work stopped, as trade routes closed, as prayers lengthened and hopes shortened. This was not a single event, but a new presence in the world. The Justinianic plague returned in waves, striking generation after generation. Between the 6th and 8th centuries, it did not behave like a single disaster, but more like a new season, one with no predictability or mercy. It hollowed out armies, it collapsed tax systems, it left fields untended and aqueducts unrepaired. It did not just take lives, it weakened empires. The Church interpreted it as punishment, a divine scourge on a sinful people. Priests walked through empty streets with incense and relics, chanting hymns to saints who had once ended droughts or healed the blind. But this plague would not yield. It did not listen to bells or incense. It crept where it willed. The faithful dug mass graves by candlelight monks, coughing behind their chants, nuns fainting as they wrapped bodies in linen soaked in vinegar. Even the saints were silent this time, or perhaps sleeping through the catastrophe. Doctors, too, had no answers. they still operated under the ancient teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, who had never written about this kind of death. There was no humoral imbalance to explain it, no chart of stars that could predict its course. Some tried poultices and purging and prayers mixed with crushed emeralds. Others recommended isolation or the burning of aromatic woods. But nothing stopped it. The rich fled to the countryside, only to find that their distance was no defense. The plague moved like smoke, sometimes slowly, sometimes fast, sometimes vanishing for months, and then reappearing in towns thought safe. The imperial bureaucracy, strained under the weight of mortality, Justinian imposed harsh taxes, even as revenues dwindled as so many taxpayers were dead. The courts were clogged with inheritance disputes, the streets with orphans, the granaries with spoilage. Rot and mildew became symbols of the time, not just in food, but in expectations. Even war paused briefly, not from diplomacy, but because there were no longer enough soldiers to fight. The great reconquests of North Africa and Italy that Justinian had envisioned were slowed not just by resistance, but by rats and fleas and fever. What made this time so strange was not just the scale of death, but the confusion of it all. The people who had survived the famine and the cold and the long twilight now had to adjust to a new pattern in the fabric of life, where illness was not seasonal but omnipresent, and where mourning never paused long enough to allow for healing. This new world felt different, not just in temperature or in harvests, but in spirit. The old Roman confidence in order and reason was eroded by a creeping uncertainty. The cosmos no longer felt arranged by laws, but haunted by malice. Archaeological records show a decline in urban activity in many regions during this period. Fewer coins minted, fewer imported goods, fewer burials with grave goods, which suggests either cultural change or economic collapse, or both. Skeletal remains from cemeteries show signs of nutritional stress before and during plague waves, confirming that famine and disease walked hand in hand. And still the empire endured, though smaller, weaker, and slower to heal. The plague did not end Byzantium, but it broke something vital in its spirit, a sense that the world could be known and shaped by effort alone. The psychological toll is harder to trace, but not less. Real stories from the time began to reflect more fatalism, more otherworldliness. Ghosts and demons became more prominent in folk tales, not just as metaphors, but as explanations for a world unhinged. The idea of divine punishment became not just a sermon topic, but a way of understanding history itself. If famine was the crack, then plague was the flood that poured through it. The idea that suffering could be meaningless was perhaps too terrifying to entertain. So meaning was assigned, even if it wounded. There is something eerie in how little has survived of the voices of the ordinary dead. We have the words of Procopius and the decrees of Justinian, but not the dreams of the widow who buried her children, or the fears of the shepherd who saw his flock and neighbors disappear. We do not know how they felt watching a world unravel, whether they blamed the stars or the emperor or themselves. We can only imagine them walking through fields of stillness, through towns where the only color came from rotting fruit and holy icons hung on empty doorways. And yet life continued somehow. It always does. Babies were born, marriages took place, though perhaps more quietly, harvests returned in small ways. Fields that lay fallow were planted again, not always in hope, but in habit. Some people forgot what it was like before others could not remember anything else. Time did not stop, though it softened, became less certain. Children born after the first wave of plague grew up in a world where fear was normal, where black robes and incense were part of the everyday, and where no one made plans more than a month in advance. There were some who wrote about renewal, who believed that hardship brought the soul closer to God. Monks in isolated monasteries saw the plague as a kind of purification, a way of shedding the illusions of the flesh and returning to the spirit. They copied manuscripts by candlelight, their hands trembling perhaps from illness, perhaps from awe. Their ink preserved ancient wisdom, even as their bodies failed. And through them, through these fragile scribes, something of the old world was carried forward into the new. The plague of Justinian would not be the last great pestilence. The Black Death in the 14th century would echo its devastation in Western Europe. But the 6th century taught something foundational, that the human body is porous, that civilization is fragile, that history is not a march forward, but a strange spiral, sometimes radiant, sometimes ruined. The rats and fleas did not know this, of course. They were only seeking warmth and blood, but in their seeking they redrew the map of human fate. We live now in a time far removed, and yet not so different. Illness still moves through ports and cities, still humbles kings and crowds alike. The idea that the world can be planned, controlled, managed is one we continue to cherish, but the 6th century reminds us of something quieter and darker, that history is filled with forgotten griefs, that what survives is not always what mattered most, and that the line between order and collapse is thinner than parchment and just as easy to tear. It is a strange and heavy thing to imagine the slow collapse of something once thought eternal. Stone empires do not crumble all at once. They do not simply topple like statues pushed from plinths. Instead, they sag quietly behind golden facades. Men begin to look to their neighbors with suspicion rather than camaraderie. And the world, as it had once been structured and taught, begins to loosen around its seams. In the East, the Roman Empire still wore its imperial garments, but the fabric had thinned. Constantinople still glittered under its domes and mosaics, but each year its reach grew shorter and its spine more brittle. There were centuries when the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, even as the western half had long since given up its last emperor to Germanic swords, the East persisted. The bureaucracy remained a Byzantine maze of titles and protocols. The emperor still ruled as God's vicegerent on earth. But the maps tell the truth more plainly than the parchment laws. From the 6th century onward, with the death of Justinian, the empire began to shrink, not dramatically at first, but like a tide receding slowly, losing coastlines and provinces one at a time. Trade routes, once bustling with silks and spices, fell quiet under banditry and disrepair. The great aqueducts and bathhouses, those Roman signatures of control and comfort, fell into uneven use. Military ranks thinned not only from war, but from politics. Generals turned usurpers, soldiers turned brigands. The plague of Justinian had swept through the eastern Mediterranean in waves, beginning in the 540s, striking cities with a ferocity rivaling anything in later pandemics. Some historians argue that half the population of Constantinople may have perished. A world dependent on bureaucracy suddenly faced empty desks. Tax collectors died, clerks died, sailors, garrisoned troops, priests, mothers, children. The silence of cities was not an abstraction. It had weight, a hollowing out. And yet, the empire survived. It persisted in a strange half-life, shrinking and reshaping itself around the blows it received. The Persians to the east tested its borders with increasing boldness. The Slavs and Avars to the north grew more daring, even within its own cities. Whispers of heresy and doctrinal quarrel weakened unity. Orthodoxy was not simply a matter of belief, was a matter of empire, of political cohesion. Each theological rupture echoed in swords drawn and banners raised. One God, but many interpretations. One emperor, but many grievances. By the 7th century, the situation became more dire. The Arab conquests swept outward from the Arabian Peninsula with astonishing speed. Entire provinces that had been Roman for centuries, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, were taken. The great port of Alexandria fell, and with it the grain supplies, the tax base, and the libraries of ancient learning. The Eastern Roman Empire began to look less like an empire and more like a fortress. Constantinople became the eye of a storm that would not stop spinning. The siege of the city in 674 by the Umayyads was only the first of many, each testing the great Theodosian walls, each a reminder that empires are only as strong as their defenders and their luck. Elsewhere in the known world, the tremors of decline were being felt in other languages and landscapes. In Persia, the Sassanid dynasty had ruled with intricate ceremony and imperial grandeur. Their court rituals rivaled Constantinople's, their armies formidable, their culture rich in Zoroastrian imagery and Persian epic. But by the early 7th century, they too were straining. The protracted and exhausting wars with Byzantium had drained both empires. Like two elderly wrestlers locked in a mutual hold, they had weakened each other so thoroughly that a younger, faster challenger could bring them both down. And so it was. The Islamic Caliphate, unified under a religious and political authority, surged across the region. In 651, Yazdegerd III, the last Sassanid emperor, was assassinated. The empire ended not with a final battle, but with a series of withdrawals and fragmentations. What had been Persia became provinces, caliphates, contested lands. the fire temples cooled, the bureaucracy dissolved. In India, the Gupta Empire had once been a golden age. Mathematics, astronomy, poetry, and art had flourished under its rule in the 4th and 5th centuries. But empires do not exist in vacuums. By the late 6th century, internal divisions, local rebellions, and the growing incursions of the Huns destabilized what had once been a coherent and prosperous domain. The centralized power of the Guptas fragmented into regional kingdoms. Learning did not vanish, nor did culture, but the imperial unity was lost. And when unity is lost, so too is the ability to project power, to defend trade, to protect harvests. In the forests and fields of northern Europe, the story was stranger still. Here were lands that had never fully been absorbed into empire in the Roman sense. The tribes of Germania, the shifting kingships of the Franks and Saxons, the brittle chieftaincies of the Norse and Celts, were people defined as much by what they resisted as by what they built. The fall of the Western Roman Empire had left a vacuum, and in that vacuum new polities slowly emerged. But these were not empires as the Romans had known them. They were patchworks riddled with warlords and bishops, alliances stitched with marriages and murders. Christianity was spreading, but unevenly, often by sword or by synod. Literacy was rare. Power was local. The old Roman roads fell into disrepair. The Latin language twisted into French and Spanish and Italian. The dream of empire remained, though Charlemagne, centuries later, would crown himself as Roman emperor in the West, trying to reweave the fragments of a broken cloak. But in this era, the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, Europe was a landscape of ruins and reinvention. Monasteries became centers of learning and authority. Castles began to emerge as symbols of power. Trade shifted from Mediterranean ports to river crossings and inland fairs. Grain, salt, and iron now moved on the backs of oxen rather than the hulls of Roman ships. What all these collapsing or transforming empires shared was the slow recognition that order was no longer guaranteed. Roads that had once been protected were now patrolled by thieves. Borders that had once been defended by legions were now lines on crumbling maps. Currency debased, laws unenforced. People began to rely more on local customs, local lords, local gods. The era, sometimes called the Dark Ages, is not so much defined by a lack of light, but by a lack of central fire. The hearth had gone out in the great houses, and now people made do with their own flames, however small. And yet, amid the loss, there was also motion. Collapse does not mean stasis. When walls fall, seeds are exposed to sunlight. In Constantinople, even as the empire reeled, new technologies were developed. Greek fire, for example, a secret incendiary weapon that helped the Byzantines repel Arab sieges. In the monasteries of Ireland, scribes illuminated sacred texts with astonishing artistry. In Persia and India, displaced scholars traveled, carrying knowledge and practices across borders. Medicine, astrology, translations of Greek philosophy. They moved with the displaced, the exiled, the curious. In loss, there was always transmission. The stories that survived from this age are often written in the ink of nostalgia or lament. Chronicles of saints and sinners, histories of empires lost and saviors awaited. But in between these grand narratives were ordinary people, farmers adjusting to new taxes, women navigating changing property laws, children learning languages that their grandparents had never spoken. They did not know they were living through decline. Decline, like growth, is only visible at a distance. They knew only that the markets were quieter, the roads more dangerous, the prayers more frequent. The idea of empire had not died, but its form was changing. It had to. The cities of marble and gold had proven brittle. The bureaucracies of scroll and seal had withered under plague and warfare. New kinds of power were emerging, religious, feudal, charismatic. The world was being remade, not by emperors on thrones, but by monks, generals, poets, and peasants. The remnants of the old would be used to build the new. Roman stones in medieval walls, Sassanid motifs in Islamic art, Gupta numerals in Arabic treatises. Decline was not the end. It was a transformation. And as the great empires of the late ancient world weakened, something else was stirring beneath their ashes.
In the shadow-draped year of 536, as volcanic ash continued to veil the sun across continents, the great civilizations of Mesoamerica and China found themselves confronting a crisis that transcended familiar rhythms of political upheaval or seasonal hardship. The same atmospheric shroud that had plunged Europe into darkness and famine stretched its cold fingers across oceans and mountain ranges, touching societies that had never heard of Rome or Byzantium, yet were bound to them by the invisible threads of shared atmospheric catastrophe. In the jade-green valleys of the Maya lowlands, where pyramid temples pierced the jungle canopy like stone prayers reaching toward dimmed heavens, the year 536 marked the beginning of what archaeologists now recognize as one of the most severe droughts in Mesoamerican history. The Maya, whose mathematical precision had mapped the movements of celestial bodies with startling accuracy, found themselves confronting a sky that no longer followed predictable patterns. Their codices speak of years when the rains failed to arrive at their appointed seasons, when the life-giving monsoons that had sustained their civilization for centuries simply vanished into the dusty silence of unprecedented drought. The sophisticated hydraulic systems that had allowed Maya cities to flourish in regions where water was always precious suddenly became monuments to human hubris in the face of climatic extremes. Reservoirs that had been carefully engineered to capture and store rainwater during abundant seasons found themselves holding nothing but cracked mud and the bones of fish that had died gasping in the diminishing pools. The elaborate canal networks that had distributed water throughout urban centers became pathways for dust and despair rather than channels of life-sustaining flow. In the great city of Tikal, where rulers had commissioned towering pyramids that seemed to scrape the very belly of the cloud-veiled sky, the drought of 536 and the years that followed created social tensions that would ultimately contribute to the civilization's mysterious decline. The Maya elite, who had legitimized their power through their claimed ability to communicate with rain gods and ensure agricultural abundance, found their divine authority challenged by the simple reality of empty granaries and withered maize fields. The complex political networks that had bound Maya city-states together through trade and tribute began to fray as each community turned inward. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a pattern of site abandonment that coincides remarkably with the global climate crisis. Triggered by the volcanic winter of 536, Maya settlements that had thrived for generations were suddenly deserted, their inhabitants presumably migrating toward regions where water might still be found or where political systems had not yet collapsed under the weight of environmental catastrophe. The pottery shards and architectural remains from these abandoned sites tell stories of lives interrupted of daily routines that simply stopped when the rains stopped coming. Meanwhile, in the northern reaches of China, the same atmospheric disturbance that was bringing drought to Mesoamerica manifested as a different but equally devastating form of climatic chaos. The Northern Wei dynasty, which had unified much of northern China under the rule of the Tuoba clan, found itself confronting not just external military threats, but the far more insidious challenge of agricultural collapse brought on by unseasonable, cold and disrupted precipitation patterns. Chinese historical records from this period, written in careful brushstrokes on silken bamboo, by court chroniclers who understood they were documenting the end of an era, describe years of harvest failures that struck with the precision and persistence of a military campaign. The millet and wheat crops that formed the agricultural foundation of northern Chinese civilization withered in fields that had never before experienced such prolonged periods of cold and drought. The Grand Canal system, that marvel of hydraulic engineering that had connected the agricultural heartlands with urban centers, carried not abundance but the bitter news of crop failures rippling across the landscape like waves of despair. The social fabric of northern China began to unravel as the climate crisis deepened. Peasant rebellions, always a feature of Chinese political life during times of hardship, took on an apocalyptic quality as starving populations interpreted the darkened skies and failed harvests as signs of dynastic collapse mandated by heaven itself. The mandate of heaven, that fundamental principle of Chinese political philosophy which held that natural disasters reflected the moral failings of rulers, provided a convenient framework for understanding the unprecedented catastrophe that had befallen the realm. In the imperial capital, where courtiers had grown accustomed to the elaborate rituals and refined pleasures of palace life, the reality of empire-wide famine created a cognitive dissonance. Chinese poets would later describe with the haunting metaphor of dreams dissolving in daylight. The emperor, who had been raised to believe that his virtue could ensure cosmic harmony, found himself confronting evidence that the very heavens had turned against his reign. Palace records from this period document desperate attempts to appease angry deities through increasingly elaborate sacrificial ceremonies, as if the proper combination of ritual gestures might convince the sky gods to lift their atmospheric curse. The collapse of agricultural systems in both Mesoamerica and China during this period reveals the profound interconnectedness of human civilization and climate stability. These societies, separated by vast oceans and mountain ranges, possessed no knowledge of each other's existence. Yet they were united in their vulnerability to the same atmospheric disruption that had originated thousands of miles away in the volcanic furnaces of Indonesia or Iceland. The ash and sulfur compounds that had been blasted into the stratosphere by volcanic eruptions recognized no political boundaries, acknowledged no cultural differences, and respected no human claims to divine favor or technological sophistication. The agricultural techniques that had sustained these civilizations for centuries proved inadequate, confronted with climatic conditions that fell outside the range of historical experience. Maya farmers, whose ancestors had developed sophisticated understanding of seasonal patterns and soil management, found their accumulated wisdom useless when faced with drought conditions that persisted far beyond anything recorded in their oral traditions. Chinese agriculturalists, who had perfected irrigation techniques and crop rotation systems over millennia of careful observation, discovered that their methods were calibrated for a climate that no longer existed. The political structures that had evolved to manage these agricultural societies began to buckle under the pressure of sustained crisis. Maya rulers, whose authority depended on their ability to ensure fertility and abundance through proper ritual observance, faced populations that had lost faith in the efficacy of traditional religious practices. Chinese administrators, trained in the Confucian principles of harmonious governance, found themselves managing not prosperity and order but famine and social dissolution. The demographic consequences of the climate crisis that began in 536 would reshape both regions for centuries to come. Maya population centers that had supported tens of thousands of inhabitants shrank to small clusters of survivors, eking out subsistence existences among the ruins of their former grandeur. Chinese census records from the post-crisis period reveal population declines, so severe that entire administrative districts had to be abandoned or consolidated with neighboring regions that had retained viable populations. Yet perhaps most poignantly, both civilizations produced artistic and literary works during this period that captured the psychological impact of living through the collapse of familiar systems. Maya stelae from the late 6th century carry inscriptions that speak of darkness and uncertainty in language that seems to anticipate the civilization's eventual abandonment of its greatest cities. Chinese poetry from the Northern Wei period contains haunting images of empty fields and silent villages that suggest a landscape drained not just of people, but of hope itself. The year 536 thus marked not just a climatic anomaly, but a fundamental shift in the relationship between human societies and the natural systems that sustained them. In Mesoamerica and China, as in Europe and other affected regions, the volcanic winter revealed the fragility of civilizations that had grown comfortable with the assumption that environmental conditions would remain essentially stable across generations. The collapse that followed served as a brutal reminder that human achievement, no matter how impressive, remains fundamentally dependent on the continuing cooperation of forces that lie entirely beyond human control.
The world in 540 CE was already a place of trembling shadows, a canvas of frost and faltering harvests that had begun to unravel for years prior. The skies, still heavy from the cataclysm of 536, bore the weight of a new wound, a second volcanic eruption that whispered its fury into the heavens. Somewhere, perhaps in the distant reaches of the northern hemisphere, a mountain's heart split open, hurling ash and sulfur into the stratosphere, a silent scream that dimmed the sun once more. The air grew colder, the light fainter, as if the earth itself had exhaled a sigh of exhaustion. Chronicles from the time, like those of the Byzantine historian Procopius, speak of a sun that shone with the pallor of a waning moon, its warmth stolen by veils of dust that lingered for months. This second eruption, less documented but no less potent, deepened the chill that had already settled into the bones of the world, marking the onset of the coldest decade in 2 millennia. The Mediterranean, once a cradle of warmth, that had clung to hope after the first eruption, now faced a relentless winter that refused to relent. In the highlands of what is now Scandinavia, archaeologists have uncovered abandoned settlements, their hearths cold and their timbers buried under layers of frost-preserved earth, a testament to communities that could no longer endure. The second eruption's ash, carried by winds across continents, settled into the soil, souring it, stunting crops that were already frail from years of diminished sunlight. In the fields of Gaul, farmers whispered of wheat that refused to ripen, of vines that withered before they could bear fruit. The cold was not merely a season, but a presence, an unyielding guest that sat at every table, stealing bread from mouths and warmth from hearths. The trees themselves bore witness, their rings narrowing in the dendrochronological record, a silent archive of a decade that starved the world. In China, the annals of the Northern Wei dynasty speak of snow falling in summer, a ph. The consequences of this second eruption rippled outward, touching every corner of human existence. In the Americas, the Maya faced droughts that parched their ceremonial cities, their intricate calendars unable to predict the failure of rains. In the Eurasian steppes, nomadic tribes, already strained by the earlier cooling, found their herds dwindling, their migrations faltering as grasslands turned to dust. The cold was a thief, stealing not just warmth, but stability, forcing societies to bend under its weight. Trade routes that once bustled with merchants carrying silk and spices grew quiet, as caravans struggled through snow-choked passes. In the cities of the Byzantine Empire, markets stood empty, their stalls bare of grain, while the poor huddled in the shadows of grand basilicas, their breath visible in the chill of unheated halls. The second eruption did not merely deepen the cold, it deepened despair, a slow, creeping force that seeped into the cracks of civilizations already fractured by the events. Yet, in small, stubborn acts of survival, in the monasteries of Ireland, monks scratched out their lives on the margins of vellum, their quills trembling in cold hands as they copied texts by candlelight, preserving knowledge against the darkness. Their stone cells, damp and frigid, were warmed only by faith and the faint glow of their work, a quiet defiance against the world's unraveling. In the villages of the Andes, farmers turned to ancient practices, storing potatoes in underground pits to protect them from frost, a wisdom born of centuries spent wrestling with unpredictable skies. These acts, small and uncelebrated, the threads that held societies together, even as the cold sought to unravel them. The second eruption was not just a disaster. It was a crucible, testing the resilience of human systems, revealing both their fragility and their quiet strength. The long-term consequences of this decade of cold were profound, reshaping the contours of the world in ways that would echo for centuries. Empires that had once stood firm began to falter, their foundations weakened by hunger and unrest. The Eastern Roman Empire, already battered by the plague that followed the first eruption, faced new waves of illness as weakened bodies succumbed to disease in the unrelenting chill. In the countryside, where most lived, the failure of crops led to migrations as families abandoned lands that could no longer sustain them. These movements stirred tensions, sparking conflicts over dwindling resources. While in the cities, the powerful clung to their wealth, their granaries guarded against the desperate. The cold decade was a slow bleed, draining the vitality of societies that had once dreamed of permanence. Yet it was also a forge, shaping new ways of living, new alliances, new stories whispered in the dark to keep the cold at bay. As the ash settled and the skies began to clear, the world was not the same. The second eruption had carved its mark into the earth, into the lives of those who endured it, and into the stories they told. The cold had been a teacher, harsh and unrelenting, reminding humanity of its place within the vast, indifferent machinery of the cosmos. In the quiet of those long, frozen nights, people looked to the stars, dimmed by ash, and wondered what they had done to earn such a fate. Their answers, woven from faith and fear, would shape the centuries to come as the world slowly warmed, but never forgot. The candlelit halls of history, lined with the relics of 540, still whisper of that time, their echoes soft and steady, carrying the listener toward rest, toward the gentle pull of sleep. The world of the 540s, shrouded in the dim light of ash-choked skies, seemed to hum with a quiet dread, as if the earth itself whispered of endings. The second eruption had deepened the cold, and with it came a tide of uncertainty that seeped into the hearts of those who gazed upward, searching for meaning in a sun that refused to shine. Across continents, from the spires of Constantinople to the steppes of Central Asia, people turned to their gods, their priests, and their ancient stories, seeking answers to the darkness that had settled over their lives. The chill of the previous years, already a heavy burden, now carried a weight of portent, as if the heavens themselves were passing judgment. In this fractured world, religious turmoil blossomed, a garden of fear and fervor where doomsday cults sprouted like weeds, their voices rising in the gloom. The chronicles of John of Ephesus, a Syriac bishop, speak of omens in the sky comets and blood-red clouds that stirred panic as people saw in them the hand of the Christian lands of the Byzantine Empire. The faithful crowded into churches, their prayers rising like smoke in the cold air of vaulted basilicas. The darkness was not merely a lack of light, but a sign, a call to repentance for sins uncounted. Preachers, their voices trembling with urgency, spoke of the book of Revelation, of the seals breaking and the end drawing near. Mass conversions swept through cities as pagans and doubters knelt before altars, their hearts heavy with the fear of judgment. In Rome, the Liber Pontificalius records a surge in baptisms, as the faithful sought salvation in the shadow of a world that seemed to unravel. Yet the Church was not a monolith. Debates raged among theologians who pored over scriptures to explain why God had dimmed the sun. Some saw it as punishment for imperial pride, others as a test of faith, but all agreed the world stood at a precipice, its fate hanging in the balance. Beyond the Christian world, other faiths grappled with the same shadowed skies. In the Zoroastrian heartlands of Persia, priests tended their sacred fires with renewed vigor, as if the flames could ward off the cold that crept into their temples. The Avesta, their holy texts, spoke of a cosmic battle between light and darkness, and the faithful saw in the dimmed sun a triumph of Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. Rituals multiplied, with offerings of sandalwood and prayers chanted into the night, seeking to restore the balance of the world. In the Buddhist monasteries of Central Asia, monks meditated on the impermanence of all things. Their sutras whispered in candlelit cells as they sought to understand the suffering that gripped the earth. The Chinese Buddhist text, The History of the Northern Dynasties, notes a surge in monastic vocations, as men and women fled the starving world for the solace of the Dharma, hoping to transcend the chaos through enlightenment. The plague that followed the cold, its tendrils spreading through trade routes and crowded cities, only deepened the apocalyptic fervor. In Constantinople, where bodies piled in the streets, priests and prophets alike spoke of divine retribution, their voices carrying over the wails of the bereaved. Doomsday cults, small but fervent, emerged in the margins, their leaders claiming visions of the world's end. In the countryside of Gaul, villagers gathered around self-proclaimed seers who read the future in the flight of birds or the patterns of ash on frozen ground. These movements, though fleeting, left their mark, their stories preserved in the oral traditions that later found their way into medieval chronicles. The fear of the end was not merely a religious impulse, but a human one, a grasping for meaning. In a world that seemed to have lost its moorings, theological explanations varied, but all sought to weave the darkness into a larger tapestry of divine will. In the Christian East, some bishops pointed to the sins of the emperor Justinian, whose ambitions had strained the empire's resources. Others looked to the stars, citing ancient astrological texts that linked celestial disruptions to earthly woe. In Zoroastrian Persia, the darkening of the sun was seen as a call to purify the soul, to strengthen the fight against evil through acts of charity and ritual. Buddhists, meanwhile, saw the suffering as a reminder of the Four Noble Truths, a call to detach from a world that was inherently fleeting. These explanations, though rooted in different traditions, shared a common thread: the need to make sense of a world that felt broken, to find purpose in the cold and the plague that followed. The turmoil of these years was not just a matter of faith, but of survival, as communities clung to their beliefs to navigate the uncertainty. In the monasteries of Ireland, far from the centers of empire, monks recorded tales of omens and miracles, their quills scratching out stories of saints who defied the darkness with acts of courage and compassion. In the markets of Chang'an, Buddhist merchants shared alms with the starving, their generosity a quiet rebellion against despair. These acts, small and human, were the embers that kept hope alive even as the world seemed to teeter on the edge of oblivion. The religious fervor of the 540s was not merely a response to crisis, but a reshaping of the human spirit, a forging of new myths that would echo through the centuries as the skies began to clear. The apocalyptic thinking of these years left its mark, a shadow cast across the emerging medieval world. The cults faded, their voices drowned out by the slow return of light, but the questions they raised lingered. Why had the world suffered? What did it mean to live in a cosmos so vast, so indifferent? These questions, whispered in the candlelit halls of churches and temples, carried a weight that would shape theologies and philosophies for generations. The listener, drifting through these stories, might feel the cool stone of those ancient halls beneath their feet, the faint glow of a distant candle guiding them toward rest, toward the quiet embrace of sleep. The world that emerged from the shadowed decade of the 530s and 540s was not the one that had entered it. The twin eruptions, the relentless cold, and the plague that followed had carved deep furrows into the fabric of human societies, leaving behind a landscape both scarred and strangely new. The year 536, with its dimmed sun and frozen fields, had been a wound, and the second eruption of 540 had deepened it, setting in motion changes that would ripple across centuries. In the candlelit halls of history, where the relics of this time still whisper, one can trace the slow transformation of empires, kingdoms, and villages as humanity bent and reshaped itself under the weight of those darkened years. The long shadow of 536 stretched far, touching the roots of feudal Europe, reshaping early medieval kingdoms, and thinning the threads of global populations, as if the earth itself had paused to catch its breath in the Byzantine Empire, the heart of the Eastern Roman world. The disasters of the 530s weakened an empire already strained by ambition. Emperor Justinian's dreams of reconquering the West faltered as granaries emptied and armies dwindled, their ranks thinned by plague and hunger. The Codex Justinianus, that monumental legal work, was completed in 529, but its enforcement wavered as the empire grappled with economic collapse, its trade routes choked by ash and unrest. Cities like Constantinople, once vibrant with commerce, grew quieter, their streets haunted by the memory of plague victims and the specter of scarcity. In the countryside, rural communities turned inward, their ties to the imperial center fraying as they sought self-sufficiency. This shift, subtle at first, laid the groundwork for the feudal systems that would define medieval Europe, where local lords and fortified manors became islands of stability in a sea of uncertainty. Across the North Sea, in the lands of the Anglo-Saxons, the cold and its aftermath nudged societies toward new forms of organization. Archaeological evidence from sites like West Stowe in England reveals smaller, more tightly knit villages where communal bonds strengthened as a bulwark against scarcity. The old tribal allegiances, once fluid, began to harden into the foundations of early kingdoms as leaders consolidated power to control dwindling resources. The Venerable Bede, writing later, would hint at these turbulent years, describing a time when the land itself seemed to turn against its people, forcing them to forge new paths. The cold had not just chilled bodies, but reshaped societies, drawing lines of power that would endure for centuries. As petty kings rose to claim authority, over fragmented lands in the east. The Northern Wei dynasty of China, already fractured by internal strife, buckled under the weight of failed harvests and social unrest. The annals of the period record famines that drove families from their homes, their migrations, swelling cities, and straining their fragile order. The collapse of the Wei in the mid-6th century gave rise to successor states, their borders redrawn in the wake of depopulation and economic strain. Across the steppes, nomadic tribes like the Turks found their herds decimated, their movements curtailed by grasslands that no longer sustained them. This disruption, documented in later Chinese histories, pushed some tribes toward new alliances, laying the seeds for the Turkic Khaganate, a power that would shape the Eurasian world for centuries. The disasters of 536 and 540 were not merely calamities, but catalysts, reordering the human landscape in ways both subtle and profound. The global population, already battered by plague, shrank under the strain of these years. Estimates, drawn from archaeological and textual records, suggest a decline of millions as famine and disease took their toll. In the Americas, the Maya faced their own trials, their ceremonial centers emptying as droughts linked to the global cooling parched. Their fields, the great city of Teotihuacan, at its peak before the eruptions, began its slow decline, its plazas growing silent as trade faltered. In Europe, the population contraction forced a retreat from marginal lands, leaving behind ghost villages now studied by archaeologists, their fields reclaimed by forest. This thinning of human numbers was not just a loss, but a reshaping. As survivors clustered in new centers, their lives intertwined with the land in ways that would define the medieval world. The long shadow of 536 touched culture and belief as well, weaving itself into the stories people told. In Ireland, monastic scribes recorded tales of saints who worked miracles against the cold, their hagiographies a blend of faith and defiance. These stories, preserved in texts like the Annals of Ulster, became the scaffolding of a new Christian identity, one rooted in resilience. In Persia, Zoroastrian priests wove the darkness into their cosmology, their rituals adapting to a world that seemed to teeter on the edge of chaos. The Buddhist world, too, bore the mark of these years, as monasteries became refuges for the displaced, their walls a bulwark against despair. The disasters of the 530s did not just break societies, they forged them anew, their scars a testament to human endurance. As the world warmed, slowly and unevenly, the changes wrought by 536 and its aftermath became the foundation of the medieval era. The feudal bonds that would define Europe took root in the need for local security. As centralized empires faltered, kingdoms, born in the crucible of scarcity, grew stronger, their rulers drawing legitimacy from their ability to protect and provide. The global cooling, though a distant memory by the 7th century, left its imprint on the shape of cities, the paths of trade, and the stories whispered in the dark. The listener, walking through these candlelit halls of history, might feel the weight of those years, the quiet strength of those who endured. The relics of 536, scattered across time, speak of a world reshaped by catastrophe, their voices soft and steady, guiding the mind toward rest, toward the gentle pull of sleep. The echoes of 536 and the shadowed years that followed linger still. Like dust motes caught in the slant of a fading light, their presence felt in the quiet corners of history. The twin eruptions, the cold that gripped the earth, and the plague that swept through its cities did more than scar the world. They reshaped it, bending the arc of human civilization in ways that resonate even now, as we walk through the candlelit halls of this forgotten time. The relics of those years: a frostbitten field, a crumbling stone wall, a faded manuscript whisper of a truth, both ancient and immediate. Nature, in its vast indifference, can unravel the delicate threads of human systems with a single breath. The disasters of the 530s were not merely events, but a mirror, reflecting the fragility of societies that believed themselves eternal. And in their reflection, we glimpse lessons for our own time, where the air hums with the weight of new uncertainties. In the Byzantine Empire, the collapse of trade and the hollowing of cities forced a turn toward local resilience, a shift that echoes in modern discussions of supply chain vulnerabilities. The Codex Justinianus, a legal cornerstone, faltered in enforcement as resources dwindled, a reminder that even the most robust systems can buckle under strain. Today, volcanologists study the ash layers of 536 and 540 preserved in ice cores from Greenland to understand how sulfur aerosols can choke the skies, cooling the planet for years. These findings, published in journals like Nature, warn of the cascading effects of volcanic eruptions, from crop failures to economic disruption, a pattern not unlike the supply shocks that ripple through our globalized world. The fragility of the 6th century, where a single mountain's wrath could starve empires, finds its parallel in our own reliance on interconnected systems, vulnerable to the whims of climate and catastrophe. The plague that followed the cold, spreading through trade routes like a silent thief, mirrors the pandemics of our era, where global travel can turn a local outbreak into a worldwide crisis. In the 540s, Constantinople's ports, once bustling, became conduits for disease, just as modern airports can amplify the spread of pathogens. The Chronicles of Procopius describe streets lined with the dead, a scene that resonates with the early days of recent pandemics, when cities fell silent under the weight of fear. Yet, in those darkened years, communities found ways to endure. Monks in Ireland copied texts by candlelight. Farmers in the Andes adapted ancient storage techniques to outlast the frost. These acts of resilience, small and human, speak to our own capacity to adapt, whether through scientific innovation or the quiet strength of collective care. The study of ancient pandemics, like the plague of Justinian, informs modern epidemiology, reminding us that preparation, not panic, is the bulwark against chaos. The religious fervor of the 540s, with its doomsday cults and mass conversions, finds its echo in the apocalyptic anxieties of today, where climate change and ecological collapse stir fears of an unraveling world. The theological debates of that time, preserved in texts like the History of the Northern Dynasties, sought to explain the unexplainable, much as we grapple with the meaning of rising seas and warming skies. Yet, where the 6th century turned to omens and prayers, we turn to science climate models, carbon capture, renewable energy seeking to bend the arc of our future. The long shadow of 536 reminds us that catastrophe can be a forge, shaping new ways of thinking, new ways of living. The feudal systems that emerged from those years, born of necessity, were a response to a world made unstable. Just as our own innovations, sustainable agriculture, resilient infrastructure seek to anchor us against the storms to come. The global population decline of the 530s, etched in the archaeological record of abandoned villages and narrowed tree rings, speaks to the human cost of environmental upheaval. In our time, the specter of climate-driven migration looms as rising temperatures threaten to render lands uninhabitable. The Maya, whose cities faded under the weight of drought, offer a cautionary tale. Their empty plazas a reminder that even great civilizations can falter when the earth turns unkind. Yet the survivors of 536 and its aftermath rebuilt, their societies reshaped by necessity into something new. The early medieval kingdoms, the fortified manors, the monasteries that preserved knowledge all were born from the crucible of those years. Today, we face our own crucible, where the choices we make about energy, about equity, about stewardship will shape the centuries that follow. As the listener drifts through these stories, the weight of 536 settles gently, like ash. On a quiet field, the world of that time, though distant, feels close, its lessons woven into the fabric of our own challenges. The candlelit halls of history, lined with the relics of a colder age, invite reflection, their soft glow a guide toward understanding. The fragility of human systems, laid bare by a darkened sun, reminds us to tread lightly, to build with care, to hold fast to the small acts of resilience that carry us through. As the night deepens and the mind grows heavy, the whispers of 536 fade into a soothing hum, a lullaby of history that carries the listener toward rest. Let the shadows of that ancient year dissolve. Let the weight of the world slip away, and may you find peace in the quiet embrace of sleep. Good night.